Hello and welcome to the Guardian Review Book Club. I'm Claire Armistead, books editor of The Guardian and Observer. Our latest guest is John Lanchester, who joins us to discuss his novel Capital. The capital in question is London, and it's not the first time John has set a novel there. Indeed, he appeared at this very book club a few years back to talk about another London-set novel, Mr. Phillips. That earlier work focused on a single man on a single day. Capital is set on a single street, but that street accommodates a capacious portrayal of the way the city has changed over the last 20 years. Not just the houses, but the people living in them. The word capital, of course, can refer to money as well as cities. And book club maestro John Mullen pointed out that the economic scenario is just as important as the geographical one. In particular, how in a few short years, the UK economy went from boom to bust.
I started working on it before everything went horribly wrong. So it was late 2005, early 2006. I started it thinking that there was going to be a crash of some sort. You don't have to be that old. I suspect quite a few of us here can remember the crash in 1987. And one of the things that was really interesting was that this thing which happened, in my adult life, I already had bought a flat. It affected me fairly directly. It was as if it was in 1787. Everyone had forgotten that we have bubbles and busts. And just from wandering around the area where I live, the thing that starts the book is actually the thing that prompted me. It was noticing all these deliveries to houses, and it was as if the houses had come alive, and the houses were people, rich people. And well, that is so obviously a thing that's going to pop at some point. So I started framing the story thinking that a crash was coming. And all the crash was in my mind at that point was, in the technical term that you all know very well, dramatic irony, which is a thing that you, the audience, know, but we, the actors, don't.
But you also did this thing which is kind of more traditional in a novel, but very tricky, which is to have all the characters from whose viewpoint we see things sometimes. That seems to the reader kind of more of a dare, actually, which is trying to move so rapidly, chapter by chapter, from a female Zimbabwean political refugee who's a traffic warden to a sort of rather dislikable but quite self-possessed 26-year-old conceptual artist who...
It always feels sort of clearer talking about it afterwards than it was at the time. They're more a set of feelings, really, or intuitions, than almost to do with the texture. I wanted to have, in that vague textural way, something that felt like London feels to me. I'm very struck by London. Partly, I think I didn't grow up here. I moved here when I was 25. So lots of things to it seem fresh, and strange. And I think that I'm not sure that we all appreciate just how extraordinary a place it is and how much it's changed. It's the kind of change you get after wars or revolutions, in the last 30 or 40 years. It's a completely different city. And one of the things about it is that the world really presses on London. And I wanted to have a structure that, just as the world presses on this city, the city presses on this street. There's a thing that V.S. Pritchett said, I think it was about Kipling, that his characters are thickly neighboured. I wanted it to feel not oppressively crowded, but to feel, thickly neighboured. The kind of squeezedness of the communal life they have isn't actually paralleled by that feeling of being in a community, because that's one of my experiences of London, that we live in this astonishing kind of sardine-like proximity, and yet we have so extraordinarily little to do with each other. Our lives barely touch against each other. That was one of the things I wanted to try and
it must always
feel for.
I sense that there's a kind of pleasure too in doing. I mean, there's some of the bits which, as a reader, I think are most enjoyable, and therefore, presumptuously, I sort of tend to think must have been quite stimulating to write. Are the bits where, by using this device, you sort of just see things through strange eyes, strange to you or strange to most readers. What does the behaviour of people drinking on Clapham Common look like to somebody from Poland? By using these characters, you can sort of make strange things which actually are very familiar.
I was trying to write about things that you get used to seeing in a way that you're you're not used to take a layer of familiarity off. It's one of the things that makes it feel new, is that there are so many people here to whom it is new. That didn't happen in the writing. I spent as long planning it as I did writing it. But I was very struck by that thing in the census. The 2011 census came out a couple of months ago, that white British are 45% of the population in London. I don't think there will ever have been another capital city anywhere in the world where that was true.
The other thing is either Patrick or his son seeing people in London, and I come from the provinces, and it's definitely not the same in the provinces, constantly, almost nervously busy doing something, so that even leisure becomes a very busy thing. Even somebody waiting, it looks like it's become, London, people waiting for something in London, they're doing it sort of actively.
As if it's a job.
Yes, they're constantly checking things, and
That's been a change. I remember when I was a student, the first time I went to America, thinking, very, very struck in New York, that there was a sort of edge, as if the air was slightly caffeinated, and there was an edge of impatience and, possibly anger, sort of, that was there all the time. And I noticed that if I'm away from London for more than a couple of weeks, I noticed that, and I noticed what an angry place it seems.
Yes. And what about the particular characters that you've chosen?
It wasn't so much choosing them as they choosing me, in the sense that I could only write about things that kind of caught my attention. It's actually really complicated to have a representative depiction of anything. You start being interested in thinking about things like who the median Londoner is, the Londoner in the middle. And there is one exception to it, which was Zbigniew, because I did want a Pole, mainly because after the Poland's accession to the EU, the Polish immigration to Britain was the largest migration by national and ethnic group ever, including the initial Anglo-Saxon invasion that displaced the Celts. And I thought, in all conscience, I had to have a Pole. And then one day we had a Polish builder, of course, doing some painting in our house, and he asked for my Wi-Fi password, and he had his laptop hooked up to the Wi-Fi, and he was day trading stocks and shares while he'd put on a roll of paint, and then he'd go over and he'd check his stock portfolio. And there was something really striking about that, and he spoke almost no English, but that became a kind of seed that I then started thinking, God, I wonder what your life is like. I wonder who you are. I wonder what it's like to be you. I did want to kind of separate the research and the explanation from the book. And the majority of the research, in quotes, in it is things that I've just been looking at for years and years. So there's the football stuff in the book. Comes from, I used to write football match reports and have been interested in that world ever since. I didn't go and formally research it, but on the other hand, I have been following it for 20 years. And the particular point in the book, Freddie gets an insurance payout for not playing, and I'd first heard about that 20 years ago, and it sounded such a sort of monstrous inversion of value, that you actually get this giant cash payment contingent on you never doing the thing you do again.
And the kind of range of characters with their own different preoccupations. Did you have kind of policy decisions about how to distribute the novel amongst them?
The decision came from that feeling of rhythm, like who you want to hear from next. And it was the fun bit, actually. At the start, it feels airy and spacious, and you could be doing anything, but a novel feels like a degree of shelter over your head. You have some structure and some sense of the kind of space you want it to occupy. And then you go on a bit more, and you're actually in a tunnel. And that's always the point at which you start hating it. Mm-hmm. And you wish, and I'm very particularly prone to wishing I was writing that other book, because I usually had another thing I was thinking about doing, decide to do this, get past the point of no return, and think, oh bugger, I should have been doing that other. I hate this book. The other book is the one I should have written. The only thing you can do about that is, firstly, you learn to just ride the mood swings, and the other thing you can do is prepare. So I really spent a lot of time thinking about those choices in advance, because I know that once I get past a certain point, I won't be able to tell, because I'm going to hate everything about it. The other thing about you spend a lot of time thinking about the kind of structure and shape and the chapter and the rhythm and all that, but I don't know what they're going to say within that framework. I don't actually know what they're the kind of micro detail of what they're going to do. I just know have the architecture and shape.
When you were writing it, did you find yourself preoccupied by a word that readers use a lot with this kind of book, which is sympathy, where it's sympathising with? I mentioned Roger. He ends the novel. He is, in some ways, the representative of the particular age that the novel negotiates its way through. He's the character who thinks more bad things than anybody else.
You can relate to him.
Yes, that makes him the most, in a way, attractive character. The more bad things somebody thinks in a book, the more vivid they are somehow.
I thought everyone was going to hate him. I was interested that people don't seem to. And I think it's partly because he's weak. You know, in a different world, a different media, he'd be a different man, and a better man probably, and that's true for most of us. At the same time as he's psychotic. If you were told that you were going to get £1 million bonus, you know, you might get a 7-figure bonus this year. On the Monday you were told it, you think, oh my God, that's the single most amazing thing that's ever happened. By about a week later, you'd be thinking, what, £1 million? Yeah, you know, it's on the L'Oreal model, it's because I'm worth it. And about a week later, you'd be thinking, you'd have talked yourself into needing the money. Yeah. And that's the thing about Roger. He's nice, reasonable, ordinary, and he's also insane.
Is he? I don't know. I think he's too believable to be insane.
I mean, psychotic in the textbook sense of out of touch with reality.
Yeah.
It's normal in his world.
Yes.
And his story, I hate the word arc because it's so overused, but his story of not realising and then having all these terrible things happen, terrible to him, and this sort of bucket of cold water in the face, is the one that is most generally familiar.
You must have been aware that the way each character ends is going to be read by readers as a kind of decision, even if you didn't feel it was a decision.
But it's where that frame stops.
Yes.
But that's not quite the same thing as the full moral summing up. The thing I've come to think about the English tradition, specifically the English tradition, is it's saturated in moral judgment in a way that the French and Russian novels aren't. The English tradition is all about judging. And the writer I particularly don't like is E.M. Forster. And he does this very striking thing of Forster's constantly judging his characters and telling you what to think about them, while equally constantly pretending not to.
And Arabella, she provoked quite a lot of disagreement between the students. Some of whom said, I know people exactly like her. I've worked for them as a nanny.
I've been struck by the response to her. I had two friends separately ask me if she was based on their ex-wives. There's this much used convention in fiction of all sorts, movies, TV, novels, plays, everything, that people realise things. Light bulb goes on, they have a moment of clarity and they see it clearly. Yeah. And in my experience of life, nobody ever realises anything. And so I did want to have a character who has a whole set of things happen that should cause a realisation, should cause a light bulb to go on, and just doesn't. You know, to be a kind of fixed point, fixed in their sort of selfness, to not change and not see. In a sense, she is Roger's punishment.
Yes, yes. Well, I don't know if we've got sort of Arabella defenders. Who would like to...
Can I just say before the questions start, it's very nice to see a normal-looking audience, because I was just at the Leipzig book, and it's a huge German trade fair. It's 160,000 people go over 4 days, and they offer free entry to anyone in costume. But they don't define costume, it's just any costume. So the last time I was looking out in a room like this, there were Yetis, there were Star Wars characters, there were several Japanese schoolgirls. So, you know, you're very soothing on the eye.
Could you say something about the difference between writing fiction and non-fiction, how that gear change works for you?
By accident is the first answer. I finished a draft of this, and then I had all this research, and I've been following the real crash in parallel with the one I made up. And so I wrote Whoops quite quickly, you know, to quarantine the research, and because I got so interested in it. And in a funny way, I've thought about it more after than I did at the time. You know, it seemed like a natural thing to do, but I've been reflecting on it more subsequently. I think partly the difference is that you can do pretty much anything in a novel. I mean, the kind of defining case I always think is there's that John Updike novel, Brazil, where the characters change race and gender halfway through. And it's sort of, I mean, it's bizarre, but it's plausible. And, people can travel to outer space, you can do absolutely anything you like. But it has to feel true. The crucial criterion is the sort of subjective impression of it feeling truthful. And a thing about life is that lots of things don't feel true at all. They just happen to be true. Lots of things happen which are wildly unlikely and implausible and strain your credulity, but they just happen to have the status of fact. And it's very difficult to write about implausibility. It's very difficult to write about unlikeliness and strangeness in a novel without having it break the kind of fictional frame. And it's the parallel thing that we were talking about earlier about explanation. I think that wild implausibility by definition is difficult to make plausible in fiction, but wild implausibility is around us all the time. But lots of things about the credit crunch wouldn't work at all in a novel just because they're just too unlikely, but they did happen.
You've been talking about the way that the book is made up of lots of little perspectives, varying perspectives. But I was wondering if you'd considered publishing the book in a different way which would reflect that, maybe serialising it like some of those great Victorian novels were first published.
I have thought about that, actually. I thought about it in relation to Capital after I'd already finished a draft of it. And the thing I thought then was that it would be a bit fake to, as it were, retrospectively serialise it, having written it. But it's a thing in fact, as John knows well, because I asked him for a reading list of about Victorian serialisation. I'm really interested in doing it, and I'd quite like to give it a go. I wonder whether there would be this interesting thing that would happen was that because you're actually writing it in a condition of urgency, the book might actually feel urgent. Something might come through, because lots of novels don't feel particularly urgent, because the honest truth is they're not. But there might be a sort of transmission, not in the subject, but just in the texture and feel of it. It would kind of feel pressing. And then also, as an each-way bet, you can do what the Victorians did and take a bit of time and kind of polish it up and write it in book form. And it seems to me that I would like to give that a go. It seems to me a really interesting moment. The person who did it, everyone now forgets. The Bonfire of the Vanities was initially published serially. It was initially published in Rolling Stone. And there was a very, very, very striking change between the early version and the finished novel. As I'm sure many of you will know, there's a main character called Sherman McCoy, and he's this completely obnoxious banker. In the draft, in the Rolling Stone thing, he's a writer. He's not a banker. He's a writer who's just landed a 7-figure bonus. And the kind of spoilt, oblivious rich kid is a writer. And then, as he was working on it, Wall Street really started taking off in the 80s, and Woolf saw that he was missing this other subject. And so we thought there's something really interesting about that ability to, in real time, try a draft and then see that kind of the things that would change as you were writing it, and that you would see more clearly. And publishers are slightly wary of it because they think it would kill the audience for the finished book, but it didn't for Woolf, so I didn't see why it wouldn't work again.
I'm really interested in hearing more about the device of the "we want what you have" that starts out for me really strong at the start, and there's obviously a linking device, but by the end I'd almost forgotten about it. And when you get to the point where you find out what's behind it, I went, oh yeah, why did it disappear, I guess?
I fell to thinking about this thing about what we have in common with our neighbours. It presses on me a bit in London, there's something so striking about this thing about the proximity and the distance. Paul Theroux, who lived in London for many years, said a wonderful thing about one of his books about not getting to know your neighbours on the sound British principle that if you do, you'll probably just hate them anyway. And I've always been really interested in that there is a sort of disconnectedness about it, and there is also, though, a kind of almost a form of politesse. That we're so in such close proximity that you're sort of respecting each other's boundaries by not knowing anything about them. So I was thinking about that fact and about this idea of this street where hundreds of people live and their lives don't touch. And so that idea came from thinking about what it is that they have in common. And what they have in common is this thing about people wanting the idea of their lives because their houses are rich, and that that it's assumed that they're rich and prosperous, even though it's obviously much more complicated than that. That's in a sense the only community in the book comes through those cards. And I wanted it to have that initial sense of impetus, but also to feel quite frail and quite fragile, because my experience of that sense of community in that geographical sense, in my experience, doesn't exist. People have work communities, family communities, communities of friendships and interests, but community in the sense of geographic, in the kind of politician sense of the people who live in one place are a community. In my experience, there just isn't that anymore. So I wanted to have a feeling of fragility and transience, because actually, in real life, they wouldn't know each other. Their lives would barely brush up against each other. It happens in the book in a way that it wouldn't really in life. So what I wanted to, as it would try and get both, I'm not sure I succeeded, but that was the idea in trying to capture both those feelings.
I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about how you make writing pay now, and how that's changed for you since your first book.
My first book came out at a time when there was a platform for a certain kind of, people use the phrase literary writing, because just to make clear, it's not as a genre, so that kind of writing. And people would, back and support a book and would sort of get writers started off. And I've benefited from a pure fluke of historical accident, in that there was this new public and this new way of reaching the public. And, I came along at the point where readership could build up. And I've benefited from that. And that the answer is that, it's a fluke of timing. I think it's much harder now, because I think although anyone can get published online, and there are more ways of getting your sentences on a platform of some kind, it's much, much harder to actually get the platform to a readership, because the book trade doesn't function in the same way. It doesn't take... Actually, Waterstones are trying to do it with the thing about promoting first books, so I must acknowledge that. So maybe it's starting to come back. But there's been a kind of gap, and I think it's much, much harder to get started now. It's much harder to build a readership and to have people know your books. And there's going to be a transition point to more direct forms of distribution, and writers will sell their ebooks directly, and, it'll be, I suspect, quite a good moment to be a writer within about 5-10 years, because the economics of the book business are going to change as direct distribution becomes more important. But this is a very, very difficult period, this 5 or 10 years, particularly for people just starting out. And in my own case, I'd like to claim it was some other mystery ingredient, but thinking about it and having seen the shift, and having seen the shift also in things like the newspaper business, I think just the answer is dumb luck.
I wondered if you felt that things have actually already moved on from where you were charting the street. I've got a street very like yours, or what's happening now, it seems to me, is that the middle class are cashing in and selling out to the millionaires. And now we're seeing empty houses, but very, very expensive, while the kind of subterranean swimming pool gets built and that sort of thing.
I hadn't seen it around us, but I keep hearing that about parts of London. There was, again, second time I mentioned the census, but there was something extraordinary about the fact that Kensington and Chelsea is the wealthiest borough. I think it's the wealthiest parliamentary constituency in the entire EU per capita. Yeah. And wealth normally is a magnet for jobs and people, but the population is falling. That's really, really strange and dark, actually, as a thing to have these concentrations of... It's like black holes, concentrations of capital so great that they're actually forcing particles away. So I'm very interested by that, but the kind of bits of London on the monopoly board are gradually emptying, the expensive bits are gradually emptying out. So I do think it's moved on. It hasn't happened in the bits that I'm writing about in the novel, because they're not those sort of crazed, super prime bits of London which, all the capital is fleeing other parts of the world to go to. But I do definitely think there's an interesting subject there. We were talking about it just before, actually. The thing that really stays with me, a statistic I saw, £406 million worth of property bought in Mayfair, Knightsbridge and Kensington so that's £500 million worth of property in 3 boroughs in 6 months of 2011, only by Greeks and Italians. And that's an astonishing degree of capital inflow and it's obviously going to change things and rewrite things. So absolutely the story is moving on.
I think we've got to the stage where anybody who wishes independent financial counsel can, under the guise of getting their book signed, approach John at the end. I'd like to thank all of you who for coming and for your questions, and to thank John very much as well on your behalf.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
For more great downloads, go to guardian.co.uk/audio.